to Small Publishing in a Big Universe. I am your host, Lisa Jacob. This month we have a special episode with our horror panel just in time for the spooky season. From our sponsors this month, Water Dragon Publishing has Dragon Gems Summer 2024 Anthology. Traveler by Andrea Montague. Graveside Press, a new imprint, has an anthology, Soul, and 7 Curses by J.C. Lee. And in their Tiny Terrors this month, Middleton Manor by Sandra J. Paul. And Island of the Drowned by Rose Strickman. She will have her revenge. Z-Fei was orphaned at a young age in China and has been alone ever since. But when she visits Japan and meets Akio, the pair become inseparable. While enrolled in the University of the West Midlands, Z-Fei falls victim to bullying, abuse, humiliation, and outright negligence, not only from her peers, but even the university staff meant to protect her. When Akio dies under suspicious circumstances, Z-Fei is yet again alone. Bereaved, traumatized, and shouldering the weight of grief all on her own, her breaking point has been reached. Z-Fei's unbridled rage releases a curse, and its victims are those she holds personally responsible for Akio's death and her own unhappiness at the university. From the professor who mocked her in front of the class, to the security guard who assaulted her, and even her old flatmate. These 7 people will go their separate ways and may hardly remember the young woman they ruined, but they all have one thing in common. None of them are safe. 7 Curses is available this month from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Smashwords, and other online booksellers. Or support your local independent bookstores by ordering it through bookshop.org. For more information, visit their website at graveside-press.com.
We are starting with some introductions. First of all, my name is Hannah Rebekah Graves. I work at Graveside Press as an acquisitions manager. What that means is that you send a story in and I read it and I decide whether that story goes into a pile for other people to read it and make choices on it, or if it gets rejected. Horror is pretty much my entire life. That and eyeshadow palettes and stuffed animals.
My name is Kelley York. I am the kind of jack of all trades at Graveside Press. I'm doing covers and handling the position of managing editor. So I'm usually the one you guys talk to about your covers and your edits and all of that kind of fun stuff. I am also big into horror, not quite so much as Hannah Rebekah is. I'm into gaming, tabletop gaming, that kind of stuff. I am also an author, so I kind of have my hands in a little bit of everything.
I'm Shy. I write under the name Arlo Z Graves, which was not invented because I submitted to Graveside Press. It's a conglomeration of my grandfather's names and the name I used to use working in a restaurant. And I love horror. I write horror fantasy and dark fantasy. And I believe the piece that Graveside Press has is definitely more on the fantasy side, but I also write more horror-centered horror as well.
I'm Hannah. I have a piece in Soul and a piece as well in Bite, both of them forthcoming from Graveside. I spend most of my time doing tabletop games and ignoring my to-be-read pile and chasing around 2 goblins that live in my house that I'm in charge of.
I'm Alexa. I write fantasy, horror, dark fantasy, dark science fantasy.
Our first question is, what does the word horror mean to you?
Horror to me is catharsis. It's a way to explore a lot of different things, whether it's like repressed emotions, phobias. It's a slow build. It's the culmination of terror, right? If you're talking about horror writing, it's like that sweet spot of dread. And whether it's like leading up towards the culmination of a film or a book, it's always centered in catharsis, whether it's the pinnacle or the ending. It's this big outburst of emotion. And I think, to me, that's what horror is, an emotional catharsis.
Alexa?
I'm a terrible person to ask, I feel, because a lot of the time when other people consume a piece of media and find it to be horror, I don't necessarily agree because my threshold is so way higher, right? It's like spicy food. Some people are very sensitive and then others are not and don't find anything spicy. I think there's specific genres, like there's the slasher movie that we all know should be horror. There are movies in that genre that I find that I watch for fun and I don't find them dark. If you can make me feel dread, I appreciate that, but finding that piece of media that does that is difficult. So that's a challenge finding it for someone who has a high threshold for horror. And writing wise, I don't ever set out to write anything dark or anything horrific. I just sit down and write a story. And sometimes it's dark and needs a content warning, and sometimes it's funny and doesn't, how the brain works, I guess.
So for me, horror it's one of my favorite speculative fiction genres, especially coming at it from a writer's perspective, because it's this tool that you can use to create kind of a separation between real world situations, problems, or themes, and a reader in a way that I can feel can get them a lot closer to the problem than they might necessarily be able to get reading nonfiction, if that makes sense. I think it's such a neat tool to be able to discuss real topical issues from a very kind of removed way, if that makes sense.
Alexa kind of hit the nail on the head for me, and probably for Hannah or Rebekah too, that our thresholds for horror are pretty high. So I can read and watch a lot of horror, but not necessarily feel scared, just appreciating the tropes and the way the stories are told. And probably my favorite thing is the unpredictability. Part of the reason I'm not a big fan of reading a lot of romance is because most of them are happy endings, and I like going into something not knowing how it's going to end and who's going to make it out alive, and are the good guys going to win, and if so, at what cost?
I wanted to jump in on unpredictability because I think that is when you're looking for like you and Kelley are saying with the high threshold, especially if you only focus on Western media, the unpredictability is going to be very difficult to find because a lot of what we see and what we find in the media in the culture that we grow up in, we know so well, and we know the tropes and we know the beats so well that it's difficult to surprise a viewer or reader. And I found it well worth seeking out different horror from different cultures. Japanese manga has wonderful horror stories and manages to hit in a very different way than a lot of Western stuff does. At least for me, that's the case.
I love Asian horror.
When you think about it, back in the 90s, probably around the time that The Ring and The Grudge and some of those started being brought over to America, I think part of what made them so successful was because even though we Americanized them, we still kept a lot of the original tropes and the vibes from the original, and it was so different than what we normally saw. And we're a little more familiar with it nowadays because it's more ingrained in our Western culture. But I completely agree. It's a lot of fun to watch movies in other languages and from other countries to see the stuff that they find horrific versus what we find horrific.
Or the translated books.
Yes, when they're translated well.
For me, horror is all about being unsettled. If something can make me feel unsettled, then I consider it to be horror. But again, I have a ridiculously high threshold, so most of what would be considered horror to others is not horror to me because it's pretty hard to unsettle me. But if you can unsettle me, then that's horror to me.
If anyone else wants to chime in on this, I also find that there's certain horror that is just really beautiful, especially Gothic horror. the imagery and some of the storylines and stuff are just, they may not be horrifying and nightmare inducing, but they are horror and they are just extremely beautiful to imagine.
I agree completely. I am starting to get into the horror gothic story scene, and I am enjoying it despite a lack of being unsettled or scared or anything like that.
Yeah, Alexa.
All about the love for the monster and the monstrous, like Dracula, if you read the original novel, or some people consider Frankenstein a horror novel, I guess, and all about the othering and the other and how we perceive that, and how I think back then the horror was in how something other could destroy the order, the society, whatever. And yeah, I really enjoy that too. And everyone loved Monster.
And nowadays, they're not the villains. Nowadays, we're like, oh, Dracula, baby girl.
There was something about Pan's Labyrinth, and
oh, I love that. Yes.
At this point in my life, I'm starting to understand that a lot of things that I didn't consider horror might be horror or like dark fantasy. I have a really shaky grasp on genre, but things like Pan's Labyrinth and some of the other older Guillermo del Toro films, I'm like, yes, that is the vibe. Yeah, they're very like allegorical. I love that.
Pan's Labyrinth is probably one of my all-time favorite horror movies.
I guess you could say for me, there are two different kinds of horror. There is horror in which horror meets the definition, and then the horror that is an entirely different level where it's the unsettling. So I have a whole bunch of horror books that I would consider to be, by definition, horror books, but horror for my own personal definition would be being unsettled.
I think Guillermo del Toro, a lot of his movies kind of hit that vibe of...
He's very good at unsettling.
Yes. Do you have a reason why you like writing horror as opposed to other genres? I know several of us write in multiple genres, but when you sit down to write something horror-y, what is it, like what kind of mood are you in that you want to do that? I'll let Alexa go first this time.
Again, I don't ever sit down to write horror, so it's nothing that I plan consciously. But what you said, Kelley, about the gothic and the atmosphere, I think that's definitely part of it, because in writing, it's not a visual medium, right? You have to work with words and you have to use the reader's brains to create the imagery. And there's this idea of not showing the monster and of leaving stuff to the imagination. And I find that horror can require a little more of that. You don't want to be explicit with the gore if that is part of the story, but you would rather try to use the reader against themselves in a way and to let them create the horrific in their mind. Not that I'm doing any of that consciously, but ideally that's what horror does. It creates a visceral reaction in the reader. I don't know how to do that, but I think that should be the goal in writing horror.
Between 2016 and now, I've seen and gone through some things that have changed me. Feeling like there's a loss of control, and that is really coming out when I write. And those are the pieces that are falling more into what would be considered horror. I just got to get it out somewhere. And if you do it like nonfiction or like memoir, I feel like I just didn't get enough of it out.
Therapeutic.
It's got to be weird. It's got to be really weird.
What about you, Hannah?
Writing horror actually ended up kind of being a plot twist for me. This was the first year that I started actively writing to try to get published, and I had no idea what I was doing. I started writing for different submission calls, like open calls, contests that were all themed. And it didn't matter if I had any practice in it, I was going to try and write it. So I've done the entire gamut of speculative fiction now. And I just find that I fall very easily into horror. I'm somebody who's very prone to nightmares. I mean, the world's been a little traumatic, just a little bit.
A little bit.
So it flows a little better. When I write horror, I feel like I'm able to get all of that out. I'm able to kind of practice on multiple levels as well, because I find with horror, there's so much that you can do with the human psyche, or fears are like going back to what I said about catharsis. There's so many levels to it. You can have a ghost, but what does the ghost represent? Especially drawing from your own trauma, I think for me makes horror that much more enjoyable to write. I've always been a big horror reader, but this was the first year that I started writing horror, and I cannot get enough of it now.
Why do you write horror, Kelley?
I mean, I've written across a lot of genres. Horror, I think, as the others have said, it's cathartic, it's therapeutic. It feels like there aren't quite so many rules around what I need to do to make it to market or whatever. I feel like it gives me more room to explore. Back when I was writing contemporary young adult fiction, I always got frustrated because my books often didn't have the happiest of endings, and that was always a problem. My editors were always like, okay, well, this is kind of bleak. We need to turn it around. I'm like, but I don't want to. I don't have that issue in horror.
I write horror because I am autistic. So when I say that horror is my special interest, I mean horror is my special interest capitalized. It is how my brain is wired. It is all that I am capable of writing or reading.
That was what I was going to say, was that it's also a means of writing out our traumas, but still maintaining control of them.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
So,
oh my God.
like, yeah, that was a big one.
Vengeful spirits, echoes of the past, and tales of redemption converge in this ghostly anthology. A relic of the past wanders the empty halls of an experimental facility. An audio analyst investigates eerie voices in the background of customer calls, and a woman plays with a curse in Norway. Soul brings you a collection of 23 stories of grief, fear, fury, and revenge. Curated by Hannah Rebekah Graves and edited by Kelley York. Soul is available this month from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Smashwords, and other online booksellers. Or support your local independent bookstore by ordering it through bookshop.org. For more information, visit their website at graveside-press.com. Thanks again to our guests. We plan on publishing new episodes every second Wednesday of the month. Watch for new episodes around that time. If you want to know more about small publishing in a big universe, visit our website at spbu-podcast.com and subscribe to our newsletter. Send us your feedback by using the Contact Us link, like us on Facebook at SPBU Podcast, contact us on X at SPBU_podcast. To find out more about the books and other products featured during this episode, please visit the SPBU Marketplace at spbu-marketplace.com. This podcast was recorded and edited by yours truly, Lisa Jacob. Executive producer is Stephen Radecki. Theme and ad music is provided by Melody Loops. Enhanced transcription services are provided by Lisa Jacob. This month's episode was sponsored by Graveside Press. You can listen to our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and most of your favorite podcast services. Thank you very much for listening, and talk to you soon.